Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. In this week's episode, we have a big download on the latest immigration news with BPC regular Theresa Cardinal Brown. We'll talk about the travel restrictions related to the latest COVID variant, the status of immigration in the reconciliation package on Capitol Hill, and the restarting of the Remain in Mexico policy. Finally, Theresa and I will be joined by BPC's Fall Intern, Edvin Morales, to talk about the evolving politics of language in the immigration debate. Lots to come today, so stick around. The emergence of the Omicron COVID-19 variant has once again provoked global instability, rattling markets, leading some countries to reimpose travel restrictions to contain the new outbreaks. These travel restrictions were just beginning to loosen in most countries, including the United States, where we had recently opened travel from Europe on November 8th, and we also reopened travel from Canada and Mexico on the same day. This new variant has thrown a lot of questions at us. Many countries have already imposed bans on South Africa where this originated. Some countries like Israel and Japan have effectively closed their borders to non-citizens. But the WHO and other scientists have called for calm and are, as they begin to research this issue. But the consensus in the scientific community is divided as to whether travel bans are even effective. For more, let's turn to BPC regular Theresa Cardinal Brown. Theresa, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Blake. Glad to be here.
So, Theresa, can you break down the debate on travel bans in general and, how this sort of fits in with what we're seeing on the global health side?
Sure. So I will caveat this by saying I am not a global health expert. I am a border and travel person. So I'm going to cover it from that standpoint. But we have talked about pandemic-related travel bans several times on the podcast, including back in 2019, early 2020, when President Trump first initiated travel bans in response to the COVID virus. The first travel bans, of course, were imposed on China and then other countries as the COVID virus showed up in them. And I would say there is a debate back and forth about travel bans and their effectiveness as a response to a pandemic such as this. The thinking goes that when a new virus strain is identified in some country in the world, if other countries close off travel from that country, it can slow down the spread of that new disease into their country. And that sounds great. However, in practice, and as we have seen, almost every time when we have imposed a travel ban against a country to prevent a disease, whether we go back to Ebola or SARS or even COVID, what usually we find out is that the virus was already here by the time we imposed the travel ban. Because by the time a new virus is detected and notified around the world, travelers have already been traveling, many of them with undiagnosed cases. And so it is rare that the imposition of travel bans will completely halt the transmission of a virus cross-border. What many people hope it will do is slow down the arrival to give countries a chance to put in place their domestic protocols, whatever they may be. And that does help as long as you take advantage of the time. So with regard to COVID, we wanted to use that time to develop vaccines, to figure out what our masking requirements or travel restrictions within the country would be. One thing that the United States has not done previously that other countries have done is impose specific testing requirements on our own citizens. So even when we had bans from travel from other countries of the world, most of those travel bans did not include U.S. citizens who were returning from those countries. And we didn't always even require them to be tested before coming to the United States. So given that you're still allowing travel for some groups of people, you're still having a vector by which the virus can enter the country. What we're hearing now is that the Biden administration, in response to Omicron, may be taking some of those additional steps. So in addition to the travel restrictions in South Africa, and by the way, this virus has now been found in the United States. It has been found in the Netherlands, in Brazil, and other countries in Europe. So it's not exclusive to South Africa. South Africa was the first country to identify it as a new variant and publicize that to the world. But these new restrictions would be tighter and would apply to U.S. citizens and other returning residents, and would require for the first time testing to show that somebody did not have this disease before arriving in the United States.
So, specifically, like, what are the impacts for, you know, DHS and border protection and stuff like that on these sorts of travel bans when we're, do they have to implement new protocols? What is that timeline like?
Yeah.
What does that do to the amount of traffic that they're expecting to have? And then, I guess broader, does that have an economic impact on people's willingness to go if it's much more difficult?
Yeah. So we do know, for example, that the various travel restrictions that have been imposed since the beginning of COVID have had significant impacts on the U.S. travel and tourism industry, both domestically and internationally. And that's a significant segment of our economy. So it is true that there are definitely domestic economic impacts from these kind of travel bans. And thank you very much for pointing out the operational issues. I would say that by now, almost 2 years into COVID, the folks at Customs and Border Protection, Transportation Security Administration, and frankly, the airlines and other travel groups are kind of understanding what it means when a travel restriction is put in place. They probably already have some protocols. If we go farther and require testing, that will require some new things. But as I mentioned, other countries have been doing this. So many international airlines, for example, will know already what to do and what kinds of tests to require of their passengers before they board a plane. That is usually left to the airlines to enforce before we get to TSA or CBP, for example, when the plane lands. But even still, that information has to be uploaded into databases when the manifest is put forward. And there's implications if people are not allowed to board. And so, it does cause disruptions, right? People who had travel plans over the upcoming winter holidays are now trying to reassess whether or not they'd be able to travel abroad and or come back. So that means that a lot of airlines are fielding questions about, can I cancel this flight and get my money back? So all of this is very disruptive every time we have to do it. But we are dealing with the global pandemic still 2 years in. And so for any government that's looking at this, it's a cost-benefit analysis for the whole country, right? It impacts some very adversely. It is a challenge. The question is, does it help deter the virus from entering a country or slow down the spread of the virus if it's already there? I think at some point it has some marginal effectiveness, but I also can't discount that some of this is probably aimed at calming the public who believes that there is a way to stop arrival of virus that is identified overseas.
Well, I think we'll sort of leave that debate there as we sort of watch the evolving Omicron debate take over from Delta, and then we'll be here to see if we need to implement any additional restrictions. Next, we turn to Capitol Hill and the ongoing saga of the Build Back Better legislation. The budget reconciliation bill Democrats are hoping to attach immigration provisions to. This bill has dominated the news for much of the year as Democrats continue to debate the size and scope of the package. In particular, immigration provisions have been subjected to intense scrutiny from the Senate parliamentarian. She has rejected the first two immigration proposals as not meeting the strict rules of the reconciliation process. Quote-unquote Plan C, which is currently in the House version of the package, would grant a 10-year parole status to more than 7 million undocumented immigrants who have resided in the United States continuously for more than 10 years and impose a raft of fees on legal immigrants. It would also recapture immigrant visas in family and employment-based categories that went unused between fiscal year 1992 and 2021. So, Theresa, how likely are these new immigration provisions to pass the parliamentarian's muster? And what's next in the process if the parliamentarian does not approve it?
Yeah, so this is like reading the tea leaves. The parliamentarian is a staff member of the House majority. They are a career person. They are not a political or elected official, but their job is to know the rules of the Senate inside and out and advise the leaders of the Senate how those rules impact the things they want to do. As you mentioned, the parliamentarian said no to two previous plans that were proposed to her for legalizing some or all of the undocumented people in the United States. One was a straight up legalization. It would give them all green cards. And she said, no, that doesn't fit in reconciliation because it has a policy benefit for the immigrants that is vastly outsized to its budgetary impact. She similarly rejected the second option of moving something called the registry date in immigration law, which is essentially a statute of limitations on undocumented status that would have allowed, again, many undocumented immigrants to apply for green cards for a similar reason. This third plan is not granting green cards. It's granting a parole status. Immigration parole is not the same as criminal parole. It is basically allowing somebody to come into the United States who otherwise would not be eligible to come into the United States. And it would grab the work authorization. It is a temporary status good for only 10 years. And most importantly, it is not a direct path from which anybody can apply for a green card or for citizenship. So it's not a path to citizenship. And because it expires at the end of 10 years, it's not permanent. So the hope is that because it has a lesser overall impact for the immigrants, that might pass muster. But there's still a lot of questions about this. One of the rules, as our friend Bill Hoagland likes to say, is that it's not just about the size of the budgetary impact for a policy, but whether or not the policy is primarily about the budget. And I think there's an argument that certainly Republicans will make that even this is a significant change to immigration law that has a budgetary impact, but that's not its purpose. It's not designed to raise revenue. It's not designed to cut spending. It is designed to help immigrants. Now, other provisions they're talking about, such as these extra fees, do have a direct budget impact. And in part, those are added to the legislation to try to offset the costs of legalization. We understand that Democrats and Republicans are meeting with the parliamentarian this week on immigration and many other issues ahead of a potential vote on the bill on the floor the second week in December. But we don't know yet how she'll rule. And it may not be an absolute no. She may say that the way it's written in the House bill, no, it can't work in the Senate side. You'd have to make some changes. She may suggest some ways it could be changed, and they may try again. At the end of the day, she will say whether or not the language can work, or it may be punted to the floor of the Senate, in which case that the bill goes to the Senate floor. Somebody could raise a point of objection against it, and then the parliamentarian would recommend to the chair, who's ever sitting in the chair of the Senate at the time, to rule against the provision under the rules. It could also be part of an amendment process where Republicans will offer an amendment to strike it. And that would require 50 votes of all 50 Democrats to prevent it from being stricken. So there are still a lot of ways to go before we know whether or not immigration will ultimately make it into this bill.
And on these fees, being additional fees for legal immigrants, that's all in your mind. Is that just to get it to have a specific budgetary effect?
Yeah.
And then the practical political side of that is, why are we making it harder and more expensive for people to come here legally?
So again, the proponents of these provisions their number one concern is legalizing the undocumented. And because it's being done through a budget reconciliation process, the rules of that process are that the Judiciary Committee, which oversees immigration, was given a net number and said, make changes to the budget that have a net impact of costing the government $107 billion more. Specific number. So if one of the provisions they want to write is to provide work permits, for example, for 7 million immigrants, and the cost of that, based on a CBO estimate, Congressional Budget Office estimate, is $125 billion, well, they have exceeded their allotment. But if they then charge fees to other legal immigrants that amount to $24 billion, then their net is back in the range. So yes, the fees crassly are a way to offset the costs of legalization, and would have an impact on a lot of legal immigrants. For example, one of the fees involved is an additional $500 fee for existing green card holders to renew their green card. Now, if you have a green card, you have to renew that card every 10 years. It's like going to the DMV to renew your driver's license. You have to get a new card every 10 years. It's not really a heavy duty adjudication unless for some reason the government has reason to believe that you've done something to cause you to lose your green card status. Most of these cases, it takes about 10 minutes for an adjudicator to decide whether or not you're eligible to get a new green card. But they want to charge an extra $500 every time that has to happen. So that's a pretty big chunk to ask existing green card holders to pay. There are also fees for non-immigrants who are extending their stay. For students, the schools would have to pay amount of money per foreign student that they have. And all of these fees, by the way, don't go directly back to the government to adjudicate cases. They go into the general treasury. That's another reason we know that this is primarily about budget offsetting.
So finally, just on the recapturing of visas, we've talked about this before as being something that Congress should be looking at to add to the handle some of the backlogs.
Yeah.
They're talking about recapturing between fiscal year 92 and 2021. Do we know about how many that would represent, and would they be able to then use them effectively? I guess.
Yeah. So there are various estimates of how many the lost, quote unquote, lost green cards would be, and it's divided between family-based and employment-based. But I think the total estimate is around 400,000 visas from all of those years put together that would be added to be used between now and however long it takes the government to use them again. The question really comes down to how USCIS can adjudicate all those extra cases, because they do have very long backlogs right now. And once again, this last fiscal year in 21, we lost visas because they weren't able to adjudicate all of the visas available this fiscal year. So it would require some additional adjudicative resources for USCIS to get through them, because they would receive a lot more applications to try to do this. Now, one of the other provisions that's in the House bill would allocate fair amount of money, some $200 billion to USCIS, both to implement the parole provisions and to reduce its existing backlogs. That is not the total of the fees that are likely to come in from all of these other applications, but it would help. So there are a couple of other provisions that were in the House bill. We have to see if they will stay, that would reduce this lost visas in future years. So when the agency is not able to adjudicate all the cases that it has and visas would otherwise be lost, it does permanently change the law to allow those visas to basically continually roll over in ways that the current law doesn't.
So let's say that these provisions, this Plan C, ends up working either partially or in full. What does that do to immigration legislation ideas that are out there? Stuff like the farm workforce legislation issues. Does that hurt their chances in the future, or is it where sort of you got something done, now there's sort of like this exhale before you ramp back up, or is it something where where you think that there will be a lot of continued pressure on these other legislative priorities?
So I think a couple of things there. I'll say I'm not entirely sure. What I will say is that Congress hates dealing with immigration. We know this because every time they try and fail, there's a period of time before they go back at it again. They really find it difficult to do. And so I don't think there'd be, no matter what happens, whether it succeeds or fails, there would be an immediate push to try to do something else from Congress. From outside Congress, from all of the parties that have an interest in seeing the immigration system fixed, yes, they will continue pushing. And even if this parole provision comes through, it's, as I mentioned, it's not a permanent solution. It's not a path to citizenship, which a lot of advocates are seeking. It doesn't make any permanent changes to the way our green cards are allocated. It doesn't change temporary visas. So there's a lot of provisions of our existing legal immigration system that it doesn't fix. So, and you mentioned such as the farm workforce, many of the farm workforce might be able to get parole under this, the ones that are undocumented, but again, not a green card. So from a policy standpoint, absolutely, there's a lot more to be done. This is not the end of the story by any means. This is nowhere near what I would call comprehensive immigration reform. In fact, most of this isn't reform at all. It's providing a status to people who arguably were hurt by the existing bad laws we have, or came illegally, or however you want to put it, but it's not making enough substantive changes to the law for future migrants to call it reform, in my opinion. There's still a lot of reforms that would have to be done. Now, whether or not Congress will have an appetite to do that, next year is an election year, we know that. But again, for those people for whom this is an issue that matters, the farm community, the immigration advocacy world, the business community, policymakers who see the need for our immigration system to improve, this is by no means the end.
Thanks, Theresa. We'll keep our eye out for what the parliamentarian has to say in the coming days. We now turn to Remain in Mexico, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. The Biden administration was ordered by a Texas court to restart the controversial program in August, which requires asylum seekers who arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border to wait in Mexico for their asylum hearing. Reports suggest that the Biden administration is looking to reinstate the program in the coming weeks. They had hoped to reinstate a gentler version of the program, though many advocate groups declared that impossible. Earlier indications are that migrant adults enrolled in the program will be offered the COVID vaccine, but the restart of the program has been delayed waiting on the agreement of the Mexican government. The Mexicans have reportedly stipulated that immigration cases must be fixed within 6 months and have asked for increased development aid to southern Mexico and Central America to address root causes of migration in order to restart the program. They also asked that migrants be offered medical attention, additional resources, and legal advice. So, Theresa, is this a gentler version that the Biden administration is implementing? Advocates seem to say there isn't any way to implement a gentler version of it. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the Biden administration is between a rock and a hard place. Clearly, ending MPP, ending Remain in Mexico, was one of President Biden's campaign promises. And it was one of the first things he did when he came into office, was to formally terminate the program and start allowing people who were still waiting in Mexico for their cases to come into the United States to finish them. So it was a pretty signature issue. Now, because of the court order, they are trying to abide by the directions of the court while appealing the decision of the court to work toward restarting the program. But as you mentioned, and as they have said to the court, it requires the acquiescence or cooperation of the government of Mexico, because we're talking about people who are not Mexican citizens. And as we have said many times in this program, Mexico is under no obligation to take back into its territory people who are not Mexican citizens. So they have leverage against the U.S. government to try to get this if the government really wants to do it. But in the meantime, Secretary Mayorkas issued a memo just the other week re-terminating the program. But he said that the memo would only take effect if the court order comes down. So the Biden administration is trying to do it both ways. They're trying to re-terminate the program, abiding by what the court said were the deficiencies in the first try, while still trying to restart the program and working with Mexico to get that done. As you mentioned, the government of Mexico is saying, if you want us to work with you on this, we want it to be changed. Because under the Trump administration, many of these cases languished for a very long time. People were in very squalid conditions in the Mexican side. And obviously, this was pre-COVID. And now with COVID, Mexico is very concerned about migrants being sent back to Mexico who may have either had COVID or obtained it while they were in U.S. custody. So they're demanding changes. Now, how realistic are these changes? Well, I think it remains to be seen. Some of this is going to be on the government of Mexico, because whatever the conditions are in Mexico are kind of up to the Mexican government to oversee. So if migrants are being sent to Mexico, will the government of Mexico create new migrant shelters that are better than what were essentially migrant camps, tent camps that were along the border? Will they police these camps to ensure that the migrants are safe? There were many reports of migrants who were kidnapped or extorted or assaulted, including sexual assault, while they were in Mexico awaiting their cases in the United States. So I think if there's any version of this that is kinder, it remains to be seen. Certainly on the U.S. side, a promise to finish these cases within 6 months will also draw criticism from many immigration advocates who have called such speedy adjudications rocket dockets. and argue that they don't have due process. So I think it's up to the Biden administration to prove, frankly, that it can be done any better at all. And we'll have to see exactly what they intend to do. The rumors are it could restart as early as this week, but again, we have to kind of wait and see.
So as Biden administration is re-implementing it because of the court order, does this also, just for a casual person's interest, it would seem like, are they doing this half-heartedly? Are they required to put forward a good faith effort in re-implementing it as part of the court order? What's their obligation here?
The obligation is to put forth a good faith effort to restart it, to meet the definition of the court order, or be held in contempt of court, obviously. So from all intents and purposes, from what we understand, they are putting forth a good faith effort. They are reporting to the court on those efforts, such as creating new facilities along the border, and that what we've heard, that they're going to offer COVID vaccines to the migrants that are in their custody before they are returned to Mexico, that they are trying to set up, again, the port courts, the immigration courts along the port that can more speedily address the immigration cases. So we do see that they are making efforts, again, those efforts drawing criticism from immigration and asylum advocates. The real question here is, what will Mexico do? Because at the end of the day, if Mexico does not permit this to happen, it can't happen. And that is something that DHS has also told the court, that it's not entirely up to the Biden administration to reinstitute MPP.
Does Mexico have any, aside from extracting additional aid, some other potential concessions, perhaps on the business side, is there any reason why Mexico would choose directly just not to engage with the U.S. on this at all, and just sort of say, out of our hands, if they cross, and that's it? What sort of keeps the U.S. keeps Mexico at the table with the U.S. on these issues?
I think there are things that Mexico wants from the United States, and there are ongoing conversations about a lot of issues. We also just heard today that the Mexican government has agreed to start reissuing visas to U.S. law enforcement authorities. This was a huge issue for the last several years, that Mexico would refuse to grant visas to U.S. law enforcement agents who were coming into Mexico to work with the embassy or work with Mexican law enforcement after the United States arrested a former Mexican attorney general on drug charges. So there are a lot of issues that the Mexican government wants to talk to the United States about, and it seems that they are trying to work some of those out. Again, as you mentioned, one of those issues is about development addressing root causes in southern Mexico and Central America that they feel that the Biden administration has not fully committed on. My guess is that we've also seen announcements of additional vaccines going to Mexico, so that's probably also part of the conversation. And there may be other things that we're not completely aware of. It's unusual, I think, at least in the history of U.S.-Mexico relations, for the Mexican government to have what I would call this much diplomatic leverage against the United States, because the United States wants so badly to try to address the situation of migration at the southern border, and it needs Mexico's help to do that. And so knowing this, I think it puts Mexico in a very different position vis-a-vis the United States than maybe it has been historically in these conversations.
As we keep an eye on this, are we going to see a joint announcement on this, or do you think this is something that'll come out in dribs and drabs and just sort of move into processing?
Yeah, that's kind of unclear. I mean, the Trump administration announced MPP unilaterally, and the next day the Mexican government said, just to be clear, we didn't agree to this, but we're acquiescing to it, right? It was a unilateral U.S. decision. There was an exchange of public announcements to kind of clarify that role. It could happen this way, or the Biden administration may prefer not to sort of formally announce it. We may find out via court filing that says, hey, okay, per your order, we've gone ahead and done this. Or we may find out as people who are working with immigrants along the border start seeing their clients sent back to Mexico, and then we know that way. It's unclear which way the administration will choose to go on this.
All right. Well, we'll keep our eyes on the horizon there with all these different potential ways that we'll be able to learn the updates and sort of parse that through. Thanks very much. For our final section, we turn to a discussion on language and terminology. Some states are making moves to eliminate what they call dehumanizing terminology for immigrants from their official vocabulary. Bills in Colorado and California replace the term alien or illegal alien with worker without authorization or terms like non-citizen or immigrant, respectively. Earlier this year, the Biden administration reportedly issued instructions to DHS to use non-citizen or immigrant in its public-facing documents, unless referring to specific language in statute or regulation. This month, the Library of Congress also replaced the subject headings aliens and illegal aliens with non-citizens and illegal immigration. Meanwhile, some Republicans, including Texas Senator Ted Cruz, have criticized these actions as politically motivated. And yet the terms used to refer to those coming to the United States have continued to change over the decades. To discuss how the debate around terminology affects politics and policy, we're bringing in BPC intern Edvin Morales, who has been with us this semester. Edvin, welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you.
Edvin, before we get started, let's have you introduce yourself and tell us where you're going to school and what year you're in.
So my name is Edvin Morales, and I'm working for the Bipartisan Policy Center as part of the immigration team this fall. I come from a really small town in the Texas Panhandle called Friona, which interestingly is the cheeseburger capital of Texas. So if anyone loves cheeseburgers, well, now you know where to visit. But just for some academic background, I attend the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm pursuing a bachelor's degree in government and Mexican American and Latinx studies, from which I will hopefully graduate from this coming spring.
Excellent. Well, look, Edvin, it's been wonderful having you with us this semester. So this issue was something that you brought to our attention. What is going on in the states, and why do you think the states are taking specific action on these terminology issues? What do you think the change are, and what are the potential implications?
Thankful. So what we're seeing, I think, in the States is this movement, right, to replace the terms, quote unquote, alien and illegal in state statutes following the Biden's administration's move to use non-citizen or migrants for U.S. Customs and Border Protection communication purposes, right, with the exception of legal documents. So what I believe is going on in the States is that we're beginning to replace dehumanizing language as a way to approach all aspects of immigration in a more humane manner. And in my own perspective, I think states like California and Colorado have enacted this language change in their own statutes by using terms such as undocumented and non-citizen to pay respect to immigrants that continue to contribute to communities around the country. And I think they're doing this not just because it is a humane thing to do, but to catch up and modernize outdated language that has been historically used to seclude immigrants living in the country, especially those attempting to follow the naturalization process. But something I do want to point out, however, is that although immigration language is often used by both major political parties in message framing, it's important to remember that there's also support from both parties to use more appropriate terms when discussing immigration language. So if we can take, for example, the introduction of a bill by Texas State Representative Art Fierro to replace immigration terminology to more dignified terms earlier this year. And although it didn't get a hearing, it actually had bipartisan support coming from committee talks because, at the end of the day, the language replacement, all it would have done is use more respectful terms according to both sides. So just in my own opinion, I think that the country is moving towards more humane action towards immigrants, and elected officials in states around the country are beginning to become more aware of the societal and cultural environment that we find ourselves in and trying to adjust accordingly.
So I think the one question that they'll have is, are these terms, again, understanding that moving towards a more humane side, are they accurate? Typically, we're thinking about these terms in ways of both legislation and legal action and statute. How do these changes are these changes in response to those not being clear enough, or are they simply in trying to put a more of a human face on the immigrant who is falling within these categories?
Well, I think largely has to do more, or it's important to really realize that by using these more, humane terms, it's trying to, pay respect to immigrants, as I mentioned before, right? And using the term alien and illegal when used to describe any immigrant, right, regardless of policy or legal use, it dehumanizes an individual by implying that a person themselves as an individual is illegal rather than focusing on committing an illegal act, right? I think it's important to really distinguish between, saying that the presence of someone, on this earth or in this country is, against the law versus, separating an act that a person can do, right? An act the person can perform that can be illegal, versus the identity of a person. And so I think that's sort of, what is important to realize. And I think that states are, following and, trying to reframe their statutes, reframe their language. So yeah, and I think that at the end of the day will have a larger impact on, on policy and the way that, legal language is created when using to describe immigrants.
So thank you very much for that, Edvin. Theresa, just to turn to you briefly here, you've been around immigration policy for so long. What sort of evolutionary terminology have you seen over the years? Is this normal? Is this sort of representing a noticeable inflection point that we're hitting, or is it something that tends to change every 10 to 20 to 30 years, or is it, every 400 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think to put it in perspective, certainly I've been dealing with immigration law and policy for over 25 years, and I have seen the terms change. The term alien is a term in the immigration statute that has been part of our immigration statutes for 200 years. And it wasn't really all that controversial for most of that time. But, if you ask the average American, if you just say, what do you think of when you say the word alien? Most of them don't think of a human being. They think of a green-skinned person with dealy boppers on top of their head, right? So it's not a common use term now. And so some of this is, I think, about being more accurate in describing people in terms that are understandable. The addition of the form illegal in front of alien actually was a response to some more derogatory terms that were used for migrants that may not have been legally in the country in the past. So it was actually some immigrant advocates who first proposed the term illegal alien in response to the term wetback, which was obviously seen as very derogatory, and nobody uses that now. But going forward, again, that term illegal alien, or shortening that to illegal, just an illegal, does have an impact on how people think of the phenomenon and the people involved in it, right? We have talked often on this podcast, and I know we have written about the distinction between violating immigration law, which is a civil law violation, and criminal violations. Most violations of immigration law are not criminal violations, but when you say the term illegal, most people think of a criminal violation. And so that terminology can tend to make people think that all immigrants are somehow criminals. That is a framing device that does have an impact on policy. It has an impact on some people, how they feel about the phenomenon of people coming without authorization and how they want to deal with it. So we now see both sides of this debate using terms in a way of framing the debate. So you will see and hear most Democrats will talk about unauthorized immigrant, undocumented immigrant. They will never use the term illegal alien or illegal immigrant. People on the Republican side, particularly immigration hawks and those proposing enforcement, will enforce the use of the term illegal alien or illegal immigrant and use that purposefully because their focus is on enforcement and law enforcement. So in some ways, the current terminology is reflective of the divisiveness of the current immigration debate. From my personal perspective, I think that we can argue about terminology a lot. I'm not arguing that it doesn't have an impact on people, but it also doesn't get us closer to actually solving policy problems, right? It tends to be a way of signaling which side of the debate you're on without actually getting us toward policy solutions. So we've heard on this podcast, I try not to use terminology that I feel will cause anybody to be upset at me, because I'd rather talk about the policy than the terminology. We can also talk about terms like amnesty. When Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Control and Reform and Control Act in 1986, he called it an amnesty, and nobody said anything was wrong with that. But if you use that term today in terms of any sort of granting of any sort of permission to stay whatsoever to somebody who doesn't have permission now, that is seen as a derogatory term, and amnesty is a negative thing. And that is also an evolution. So, I think what we're seeing is some states are choosing to make this an issue on which they are trying to show their positioning toward immigrants that live in their state. And I think Edvin is right that the people who are proponents of this are trying to tell the immigrants that live in their state, hey, we're happy you're here. Other people see it as a way of sort of kowtowing to an activist base that wants to, change immigration law in ways they don't respect. I think this is going to be an ongoing issue, but from my particular point of view, I believe that fighting over the language we use is a substitute for really getting to address the policies we want to do. And I think we're better off if we can get to a position where we discuss the policies rather than just the language.
Well, and that's the benefit of this podcast, is we try to stay out of the politics and stay in the policy.
Well, we get a little of both every time, don't we?
Edvin, thanks so much for joining us on this segment and walking us through those important issues that are going on in the immigration debate. That's going to do it for our show this week. One last reminder to rate, subscribe, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discussed here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. I am also on Twitter at It's Blake Johnson. And you can follow BPC at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This week's In Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown, Hannah Tyler, and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.